The Russian Civil War. It's a really important topic, isn't it, Dole? Alright, Dole, can you have a rest? Let's talk about stuff. Lenin had long talked about turning the imperialist war into a civil war. Remember, all through 1917, well, not all through 1917, but after his return in April, he had coined that slogan, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. And that was very much framing that rhetoric of the Bolsheviks around class war. So that's really critical. That idea of class war was a major feature of Bolshevik ideology. And Trotsky said that this is after, when coming to power, that Soviet authorities organized civil war. And what he's referring to then is that, building on that, those ideas of class war that the Bolsheviks came to power with, that the Soviet regime was instituting those, that the repression of the bourgeoisie and the attacks on people of wealth would now be a formal element of the new society. However, it's not a case of like where Lenin's saying turn the imperialist war into a civil war, that what he wanted to do was leap from World War One into something like the Russian Civil War. What he's wanting to do is shift the focus of societal conflict. So you've got to be really, really clear on that. And we see that when in March 1918, Lenin declares that what has happened and Russia is witnessing is the triumphal march of civil war, and that civil war, a triumphant march, sorry, of Soviet power, and that the civil war has come to an end. But if you look at the Russian Civil War, it hasn't even started yet. What he's talking about there is the way in which the Soviet regime is firmly in power. Now, the Civil War is a critical experience. It's one that I've described as a formative experience. It fundamentally shapes the mindset of the communists, as they call themselves after February 1918. They also continue to call themselves Bolsheviks. And it fundamentally shapes many Soviet institutions for the remainder of the Soviet regime. It also had incredible impacts, and not in a good way. Lenin will describe Russia as like a man beaten within an inch of his life. So it has huge economic and social and political implications. But what we're going to be looking at today is the nature of that conflict. So first of all, and I'll get you to look at your map, and this is really useful to give you a visual sense of what's going on. First part, there's not much to look at, but we're going to be looking over here at Petrograd. So the first elements of what you might call the Civil War happened soon after the Bolsheviks come to power, and we're talking here with when Kerensky fled the Winter Palace on 25th of October. He went to the front to try and rally some support of loyal troops from the front, and he did so. He secured the support of some Cossack forces under the command of General Krasnov, and there was a battle fought, and this was Kerensky's attempt to retake Petrograd from Soviet forces, and it was called the Battle of Pulkovo Heights in October 1930, and he did not win it. The Sovnarkom, the Soviet forces, the Red Guards, and Kronstadt sailors were victorious. That coinciding with the successful establishment of Soviet power in Moscow in October 1917 establishes then the Soviet regime. Um, and that's that idea too, the building on that, where Lenin's seeing Soviet power being triumphant. That also puts an end to any sense of having to negotiate with the Menshevik Menshevik-led Vikzhel. That's the railway workers' union. So that kind of really solidified Lenin's position on the nature of the government. Now, I want to get the squiz though down. It's after if you have a looky down around this area to Rostov-on-Don, not far from the Crimea. This is in Ukraine. It's here over in the Ukraine, careful looky, that the first opposition armies start to form up. And so this was called the Volunteer Army, and that was made up of largely officers, former Tsarist officers who were fleeing Moscow, Petrograd, and they were being led by General Alexiev, who was a former commander-in-chief under Tsar Nicholas, and under Kerensky as well. And Ukraine, just for your information, is also where the Cossacks come from too. So they're able to form up okay, a force of troops who are largely conservative. However, now I want to get you to cast your eyes down over into Siberia around this way. We'll start over here and continue our story. The spark that set off further resistance more formally to the Bolsheviks was a group of men called the Czech Legion. Now, these were 40,000 troops. They were well armed. Um, they were Czech, so they weren't Russian. They had been fighting with Russian forces, so against Germany, so over here, but they'd been partially demobilized, but they wanted to continue to fight the Germans. And so they were traveling along the Trans-Siberian Railway, so making their way along here. And the eventual plan was, if they'd stuck to the plan, was to make their way over to here, to Vladivostok, and then they'd be catching boats back over to the other side of Europe. Rah, 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 rah. Okie dokie. May 1918, so turning point. So from late May 1918, the Czech Legion are travelling along the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they were antagonising Soviet forces. Soviet governments, local Soviet governments, were bothered by these men who were armed, and who were demanding food at towns which they passed, and the Czech soldiers themselves then grew hostile towards the Soviet forces, and they began to overthrow local Soviet governments from May 19 onwards. And significantly, just cast your eyes here to this little town of Samara, okay, and another little important town that will be part of this little story will be Omsk over here. But so we're talking about this region of Siberia. The Czech Legion helped to establish a rival government. They were called the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly. So evidently they were people, ex-delegates of the Constituent Assembly. Most of them were left SRs. The acronym for that was the Komok. So in June 1918, there was a rival revolutionary government that was first established at Samara here, with the military support of the Czech Legion. And they had their own army as well. And so this, and then throughout the rest of the Civil War, the Czech Legion, that's where you can see them up and down here along the Trans-Siberian Railway, continue to menace the Soviet forces along here. Alrighty, so the Czech Legion spark it all off, if you like, and now we're going to break it down into the different, which are called the White Armies. In February 1918, Trotsky, having resigned as Commissar for Foreign Affairs, becomes the Commissar of War. And in that position, he founds the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. And therefore, because they call themselves the Red Army, which has got, references to revolutionary ideology, all the armies that were opposed to, or almost all, we'll get to that later, most of the armies who were opposed to the Bolsheviks then were called the Whites. Now we're going to be looking at all those forces then in this little chart. Now, one of the important things about the White Armies, there's no clear unifying ideology that brings them all together. The only thing that makes them Whites is the fact that they don't like the Reds, that they're opposed to the Bolsheviks. There were people within the White movement who were monarchists, who would have liked to see the restoration of the Romanov dynasty. There's some who are fighting for the Constituent Assembly, republicanism, or autonomy, if you'd like. So that would be the Cossacks, national autonomy. The one thing that unites them then is their hatred of the Bolsheviks. All right, let's unpack it. There are four distinct White Armies. The first one we're going to have a looky at is the AFSR, the Armed Forces of South Russia, and that's cast down here under the command of, for the most part, General Denikin. And so the Armed Forces of South Russia under General Denikin are harassing, attacking Soviet Russia from the south east over here, okay, or southwest, sorry, okay, so moving out from Ukraine. For the most part, this was going on between 1918 and 1920. The culmination of that was in November 1919, when two assaults campaigns had the ability to threaten Moscow. So it was a very, and this army was the largest, perhaps the best armed and well trained of all the White forces, and posed a very real threat then to the Soviet government. They were eventually outnumbered, pushed back, and in the end ended up over here, see the little Sevastopol, okay, that they were evacuated from there, and that was the end of them. Now let's go back to Siberia. So over to this region over here, Admiral Kolchak. So the Kolmark, so this was the only rival government to the Bolsheviks, okay, that had revolutionaries within it, and it only lasted, okay, 8 weeks. In September, they were in November, sorry, 1918. The Kolmark, it got itself another name at one stage. It was called the Provisional Russian Government. Don't worry about that. We can just call it the Kolmark. But in November 1918, das Vidanya to that one, it was overthrown by its war minister, Admiral Kolchak, and so that's the end of that. Okay. Thereafter, Kolchak is acting as a dictator, and he's threatening Soviet Russia from Siberia. Yeah, so that's in the east. Getting my directions right this time. From March 1919 onwards. Kolchak was recognized by foreign governments, okay, as the supreme ruler of the Russian state. Just a little tangent. Admiral Kolchak, kind of interesting, isn't it? That he's in Siberia. He was a famed Arctic explorer. He wasn't the most effective of military campaigners, of military strategists. A series of counter-offensive by the Red Army forced him back along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Eventually, he was captured and executed around Irkutsk. Now, while we're talking about Kolchak, that'll lead us on to the question of foreign interventionists. So, foreign governments were opposed to Sovnarkom for a range of reasons. And took active measures then to try to overthrow them. One of the things that foreign governments, Britain, France, etc., the Allies, were deeply upset that Russia had pulled out of the war. They were willing to support any group who were going to fight the Germans. They landed troops then, so under the command of Admiral Miller. So Miller over here lands Commonwealth and British forces at Murmansk and Archangel. Those are port cities where a great deal of Allied supplies had been shipped in, and so Miller and others were wanting to secure those, so both they wouldn't fall into Russian hands nor into Soviet hands as well. But let's have a looky over here, where you can see the British forces were at work in the Caspian Sea. There's some oil fields. Oh, we all like the oil, don't we? That's some things don't change. And over here is very significant as well, where you can see that the French Navy and the British Navy were supporting the AFS. Denikin's army. Woohoo. Kolchak also then had the support of, so I'll just move the map around over here, forces from Japan and the United States who'd landed at Vladivostok. So we'll just stick on that point for the moment. Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War very much gives us a sense to the Bolsheviks that this was a conflict of imperialism and capitalism against their socialist regime, and it felt like the world was out to get them. And the world really wasn't really happy with them, or the West, I should say. Western governments were not at all pleased with them. They got out of the war. Winston Churchill said that they should ideally strangle Bolshevism at birth. So clearly very hostile. The Bolshevik government didn't cut themselves any favour by cancelling all foreign debts and nationalising a number of foreign-owned businesses as well. So, yeah, they didn't like them. They weren't too popular. On the theme of foreign intervention, though, and it's a bit more of a complicated topic. Some historians don't count it as the Civil War, but it certainly fits as a large-scale military conflict that happened around the time of the Civil War, and that's over here, Poland. So in 1920, make sure you know what you're looking at, Poland, seeking to expand its territory, in April 1920 invades Russia and has a war with Soviet Russia. That's the Soviet-Polish War, which lasts from April 1920 through to a bit past August in 1920 as well. Significantly, after Poland had invaded Soviet Russia, then Soviet forces rallied, the Red Army rallied. Some former Tsarist generals joined the Red Army, like Brusilov at this time, and the Red Army launched a spectacular counter-offensive. Yeah, thanks, Disc, we'll get rid of that. spectacular counter-offensive against the Polish forces, really pushing them back almost to the Polish capital. Turning point, though, was the Battle of Warsaw on the 12th to 25th of August 1920, where under Marshal Pilsudski, the Polish forces rally and they put a spectacular pincer movement, and the Red Army that had believed it was marching through Poland and would pass through Poland into the west of Europe and would spark off international socialist revolution, it was defeated. And so that led to a shift in mindset amongst the Soviet government, amongst the Bolsheviks, that they'd have to consolidate the Soviet regime, they'd have to retreat for a period. And Lenin says, I thought it wiser to come to terms with the enemy. We had to make peace. He's referencing there the Treaty of Riga, which was the treaty that brought an end to the Polish-Soviet War. Soviet Russia lost a significant number of territory and had to pay reparations, which cost a lot of money. The other one we're looking at is here the green forces. So this little region here and this little part here. So green armies. So we had the whites, reds. Now we're getting the greens. The greens were peasant partisans, so peasant guerrilla fighters who rose up against both white forces and the red forces. Nestor Makhno's group here were the largest of the green armies, and Antonov's green forces here in the Tambov region made that whole part, of the Ukraine a virtual no-go zone for any rivals, but both more so it was an issue for the Reds than the Whites. Lenin significantly described the Greens as more dangerous than all the Kolchaks and Nudeniches and Denikins combined, because if the Green movement spread, it would be a fundamental threat to the Reds. And I just realised we forgot about a white army. That would be General Yudenich over here, who that was the smallest of the white armies, but his forces launched campaigns that reached the outskirts, that reached the suburbs of Petrograd, and the government, which was based in Moscow at the time, was seriously, though, considering abandoning Petrograd, a red Petrograd, this revolutionary, former revolutionary capital. But Trotsky came and saved the day. Alrighty then. Now, the key little theme that we want to then take away from all this was look at the size of Soviet Russia. The fact that it had shrunk so significantly when compared to the territory that was the Tsarist Empire, or even Russia under the provisional government, and that Soviet Russia found itself faced by a whole range of very serious military threats. As the historian Boris Ponomarev says, Soviet Russia found itself in a ring of fire. So how did they get out of it? How did they win? That's going to be the next chat. До свидания.